entrance shouted that things are bad and the knights must now protect Lady Diana. And as soon as they heard the order, they started running towards her. But it was too late. They were too slow, and a girl was standing behind Mistress Diana with a sword to her head. When the girl saw it, she started to ask if this was their fighting army. They wouldn't even protect her from her weak woman, laughing. But Mrs. Diana couldn't understand what she was doing. If she wanted money, she'd give it all she had. The man in the golden robes began to draw his sword and tell her to let go of Mrs. Diana, or they would never leave this desert. Luton, standing behind, couldn't understand who he was trying to intimidate and let him try to touch them. Sun An suddenly put out his hand and ordered the man to put away his weapon. They had not come to fight, but to convince them that they are not strong enough to resist the army of demons and to listen to them is up to them. The girl standing next to Mrs. Diana realized it was pointless to hide their weapons and say they were grateful for their good intentions, but they couldn't leave this town. But suddenly the merchant started saying that he remembered him, and he was in the trading area of Area A and sold him a bunch of Class A gear. When he heard that, our hero remembered that last conversation when he sold him all the items he didn't need. Another man in golden armor came up and asked if he had bought that mountain of gear from this guy, but he said that he had. Then this man who can give so many things at once, a class is not easy, and he will accept his offer to evacuate the villagers. But there is one problem. Sun An couldn't understand if there was anything more valuable than the lives of the townspeople, and they suddenly stopped talking. They were puzzled by the question. And the merchant replied that in such a situation he thought it was okay to tell them. The people of this town are rich because at the beginning of the game a meteorite fell from the sky. When Sun An and Lu Tong heard the news, they were shocked. But the merchant went on to say that soon after the game started, the island suddenly landed with colorful theories, and at first few people paid attention. But soon special stones started appearing continuously, and then they realized that they were very valuable. All the reinforcement crystals needed to make weapons came from here, and they keep it a secret and forbid the citizens to leave the city so no one else will know about the meteorite quarry. The man with the gold armor interrupted the merchants and began to say that they had created the Order of the Golden Foot. Sun An immediately realized that no wonder he had the money to buy all the materials from him. Lu Tong, who was standing behind them, came up to them and said it was indeed a gift from heaven. But the merchant added that, moreover, among the crystals from the meteorite, there was a small chance that an extremely precious and peculiar item would emerge, like the Star Spirit Stone is required to make high-level gear. And now the boys must realize why they don't want to leave this town. When Sun An heard this, he thought that, indeed, with such a meteorite, one could have limitless wealth and many could resist the temptation. But Sun An also asked the merchant that if they had revealed the secret they would be willing to abandon him. And they must realize that if they abandoned the land, they would lose it. But if the demons broke into the city, they would lose their lives and property, and the meteorite would be theirs. So just in case, they should evacuate and destroy it. But when Diana heard that, she couldn't believe he said, "Destroy the meteorite and it's vital to this town and she won't let him touch it." And while Diana was yelling at them not to destroy the meteorite, he thought about it and then told our hero that what he said was right. As much as they wanted to, they would have to keep the quarry. Luton also could not believe that Sun An said this seriously, because it is a source of reinforcement for the whole continent. If it is destroyed, then they will not be able to get equipment. The girl behind her also said that they think it's wrong to do that, and maybe they can discuss this incident further. But Sun An, I don't understand if their eyes are clouded by wealth. It's a matter of life and death, and they've fought demons before and know how powerful they are. And if the meteorite falls into their hands, the new weapon will be used to cut off the heads of their people. After hearing that, Luton realized she was right. If they can't use it, They can't leave it to the demons. And the crystals would be of no use if they lost their lives, and all objects must serve in humanity's victory over the demons. And soon they went to the very same meteorite quarry. And when they got there, the merchant showed them that it was here. Sun An bent down and picked up one crystal, not expecting that such hard-to-find resources would be scattered all over the place. The other players were staring at these A-class materials they needed with burning eyes. But Luton shouted to them that they were here by accident and shouldn't touch the resources of their countrymen. And grabbing his partner, he said it was her business too. And when she sees something beautiful, she always freezes. But she just wanted to get a closer look at the crystals. At that moment, the merchant started to ask if they really had to destroy them. They wouldn't give them a day's mining time. But all Sun An could say was that they lost the land, but they're saving the people, and as long as they're together, they can get it back. And they can't take the crystals. There's no time to wait. It's important to evacuate the people as soon as possible, or the demons will chase them. But at that moment, one of the demons was hovering over the city, watching all the people evacuate quietly. But suddenly the demon heard a voice telling her to wake up. And when she opened her eyes, she was on some beach and she was having flashbacks. But suddenly a guy was standing next to her and he started asking her what happened. Did she fall asleep? And grabbing her hand, the guy started taking her aside and saying that she'd been asleep for a couple of days and why she wouldn't get up, because he wanted to go with her to collect seashells. But when the girl saw him pulling her arm, she couldn't understand who he was. But he just showed her to look up, 'cause I'm his mama's airship there, and their mom flew straight for them to get them out of here. And pretty soon they're gonna be out of here. But the girl couldn't understand why she remembered. The look of anticipation in his eyes for this world. But now this girl was under the control of the supreme demon. And a little while later, Sun An was sitting by the fire in the forest, and at that moment a hand was held out to him. And in that hand was a drink. Luton started to ask him why he looked distracted and what he was thinking about. But he just replied that it was nothing, but that he shouldn't indulge in it. But Lutong went on to say that even he had no idea what kind of situation Commander Hussein was in, because it's not easy to evacuate an entire city at once. But Sun An said half a day was a short time, but it was enough for the boys to take advantage of the opportunity. And one of the players shouted that he'd found something useful too. Luton saw this and got very angry and didn't understand what they were doing. He had already told them not to touch the crystals. But the guy picked up the crystal and started to explain that they were going to destroy them anyway and it would be a waste not to collect some. Well, at that moment, another guy appeared and started shouting to his Galava that he asked him to help him find the reinforcement stone, and he found it. The head couldn't understand what he was saying because it didn't happen and he shouldn't say anything against him. But their little quarrel was interrupted by a merchant who said that they had already prepared 32,000 people and 36,652 inhabitants ready to leave with them. But Sun An asked them if they could leave 4,000 men behind. The merchant said that not everyone believes in the demon torment and doesn't want to part with their riches. Sun An asked if they could let them persuade them, if they couldn't. But Luton stopped him and asked if he was planning to save everyone. But our hero didn't understand why he had to abandon all 4,000 people. The real me at the merchant said it's useless. They've already tried. And if she and Shosan didn't have the authority to convince him, he shouldn't try. Sun An didn't understand. It's 4,000 lives. But Luton interrupted him and said that he said it's a war between humans and demons, and they have no choice in facing the truth and lies. A girl appeared behind him and said she was finally finished, and they asked to set the explosives and it came out to 246. And once everyone had done their job, our hero cried out that it was time for them to leave. They went a little farther away and set off the explosives and blew up all the crystals that were in the area. Watching this huge explosion, Luton realized that Sun An was very harsh because he had wasted so much wealth. A little later, a lot of people started coming out of the tunnel, and even though the guards were telling them to hurry up, every second counted. And as soon as almost everyone had gathered and begun their preparations. But at that moment, he was thrown aside by a huge energy charge. And he couldn't tell who had attacked him because he didn't even see anything. But it was the new devil that had been recently created. The knights behind him saw that this was the enemy and they had to destroy it. The man in the golden armor could still stand on his feet, and he got up and drew his sword even though he was badly wounded. But the demon didn't give him a chance to counterattack, for she had once again done great damage to him with her greatest blade. And all the demon said was that there was going to be a massacre. The villagers suddenly began to raise their heads and saw the demons coming, and they did appear. A little while later, the demons started killing all the citizens who were screaming for someone to save them. The soldiers who were supposed to protect the civilians ran away in fear. But at that moment, a shadowy space appeared from which the players began to emerge. Luton, who appeared first, began to gather all his power and attack the demon who was floating in the air. And after throwing it aside, Luton went back down to his partner and asked her if she was all right, to which she replied that it just seemed like they were a little late. And the commander was already dead, and his subordinate from the order was already disbanding the troops. And she didn't expect the demons to get here so fast. But still, some of the inhabitants were alive, and they kept screaming for help because they weren't going to die. Luton started shouting to the guild members to listen to his orders and protect the townspeople and save as many people as possible. When they heard their commander's orders, they began to fight. But the demon was still in the same place. She didn't like the fact that the ants had gotten into the tree. And no matter how hard they tried, everyone would die here today. And as soon as it started to attack, Luton felt first its immense power, and even with the divine power of Hercules, he realized that he couldn't handle it. But the girl behind him started shouting to Luton to be careful, because she was already at his back. But he managed to bounce back a little, but the girl yelled again that she was coming up behind him. But at that moment, Sun An appeared and started using his demonic execution skill. And then he went down to the Luton and started to take him by the shoulder to teleport him to another place. And once they were in the other place, he started apologizing for being a little late. But the fact that there's another new devil means it's gonna be a tough fight. But the problem is, he doesn't know what skills she's gonna have. But Luton suddenly told him to be careful with her sword, and even his divine personality couldn't resist it. But he pulled out his bone blade and said he'd already killed one demon, so he could handle the second one. The demon standing in front of him with his eyes closed started to say he couldn't see his face, but his energy was specific, and like a drop in a pool, very warm. But Sun An moved behind her back and said he had no warm feelings for them devils. And as soon as he wanted to attack her, she attacked back even though she didn't see anything. And Sun An couldn't understand how she reacted so quickly. The guys watching from the side started asking him how he was feeling. But he couldn't realize that it was Zato who had just pulled out 1,000 daggers in an instant. But the demon raised her sword to the mountain and said that no matter how hard they tried today, they would die, because she could turn them to dust in an instant. But just as she began to attack, a Luton appeared in front of our hero, and with his Hercules power he began to increase his strength 960 times. But that wasn't enough. I started to increase my strength by 1,220 times. And while he was holding back, the devil started yelling at the guys to retreat. But he didn't have to hold back for long, because in an instant he just fell to the ground. And as the girl started to lift him up to bring him to his senses, Sun An started to draw his bone blade. But he realized that if he tried to fight her back now, he'd die in the same place. And as the Luton lost consciousness, he realized that he definitely noticed that every blow from that devil was taking a toll on his mind.
And at that moment the devil's fog began to clear and her vision began to recover.
But our hero realized that before that it was the spirit strike that had allowed him to deal with that devil. But if the enemy has a similar ability, there's nothing you can do. The devil standing opposite our hero began to say that finally she could see him clearly. To which he jokingly replied that he was worried because his warmth charmed her. But she replied in a rude tone that no, he was not the right man, for he had just the same energy, and raised his blade as he began to summon a tremendous energy and activate his 3,000 moment skill. And as the huge wave hit Sun Anyu, he refused to resist at that moment, because such an opponent seems capable of destroying the world with every blow, and maybe she's right. No matter how hard he tries, he'll die. And whether people would be destroyed by demons in the end, he didn't fully understand, and he didn't know if there was any hope in the world. A little while later, Luton began to calm down, because he saw Sun An come to his senses, not realizing where he was. And he began to explain to Sun An that they had escaped from the city of Manches. Although they had suffered minimal casualties and most of them had managed to stay alive. And Luton also added that he had been unconscious for 2 days. Sun An could not understand why it had taken so long. And perhaps the eternal crown had kept him from the death blow, but the mental attack had robbed him of his senses, and yet he couldn't understand how they had managed to escape from the devil's grasp. Luton slowly began to answer him that it was thanks to Hussein, and he had sacrificed himself to save them. For when he stood before the devil, she said only that he had not long to live, and he said it wasn't worth it to keep them all. But the devil said why should he suffer such agony, and she would ask Battis to turn him into a henchman. But Hussein shouted for her to shut her mouth, and as long as his arena and combat powers are in effect, she won't escape his control, and until her last breath he won't let her go after his kin. And he is Hussein, commander of the Order of the Golden, that of the Knights of the city of Manchester. His abilities were created for fighting, but the devil replied that he's just a man without food and VD with severe wounds. He won't last long, and she can already feel the effect of the gradual collapse. With his last breaths he shouted that it was enough for him to let his people escape to fulfill his duty as a knight. And the rest is up to them. He always believed that they would find a way to deal with them. The people will defeat the demons. And a little while later in the neighborhood, and the many people who had escaped from the city continued on their way. Luton began to say that they'd been walking for 3 days without sleep or rest, and they were exhausted, and that they should stop and rest soon to regain their strength to keep going. But Sun An forbade them to do so, for the demons could overtake them at any moment, and until they reached the city they must not stop for a minute. It was hard for the girl to hear, for she didn't understand why they had to go and if they were going to where Jeju's main army was. But Sun An, looking at the mountains, told them that they had not long to go and that as soon as they crossed the Sunset Mountains they would finally reach the place. At this time in town, one of the guys started coming to Zai Jun's house and asking her to have a drink with him. But she wasn't alone, and Feng, who was sitting next to Zai Jun, started yelling at him that he was crazy and didn't know the rules of decorum and that he should knock before entering the girl's room. But he kept laughing and asking why they were having a party and he wasn't invited. To which Zai Jun told him that girls like to gossip together, but as soon as he heard the word gossip, he started to ask what and who he wanted to hear about. Everybody likes to gossip. But his partner suddenly got up from her seat and put her hand on his shoulder and told him to get out of here. And with a flick of her hand she threw him out the window. Zai-jun then started laughing and told Nana that if she really liked Bai Mu, she should tell him because she had actually noticed that they were attracted to each other in the guild. But Nana just blushed when she heard that and said that whoever likes him is just calling her a redhead. But Zai-jun added that if you like someone, you have to be brave enough to confess. Otherwise, how can he know how she feels, and secret crushes are the most useless thing. But Nana suddenly turned the tables and started asking Zai Jun what about her. Because she had noticed in the guild that she cared about Sun Anya all the time, and she wouldn't deny that she had feelings for him. And she realized that they have mutual love. He has a look on his face that says he feels it, even though she does too. But at that moment, Zai Jun started waving her arms around, saying, "It's not true. She just doesn't like that he's always alone. And it's very sad." And Nana realized that it's true that the guild is full of single bachelors, and why doesn't she care for them so much? But suddenly Bai Mu burst through the door again. And the girls saw him and started asking why he was back again and why he shouldn't eavesdrop on their conversations. But he just had something important to say, and it's about Sun An. They have to listen to him to understand what it's about. Because he's right outside the main gate, and he's brought a bunch of people with him. And he was standing at the main gate, and he started to tell the guards that his name was Sun An, and he had 30,000 people with him, and they should open the gate. And at that moment the head of Liu Shu came to the gate and began to tell the guards not to let them out, because of course Sun An would be able to get into the city. Lu Tong, who was standing next to Sun An, didn't understand what was going on and why they wouldn't let them in. But the head of Liu Shu began to explain that his mission was to gather information about the demon invasion in the K area, not to show his bravery by saving people. But Sun An began to explain that the situation was more complicated than she could imagine, and the demons could attack at any moment, and she should open the gate and post, and they would talk. But she just smirked and said that now she is in charge of the defense of this city, so it's up to her to decide who gets in and who doesn't. And then Zai Jun started running up to the gate to make sure it was really him, because she'd just heard his voice. And once they got upstairs, they were glad he was back and started asking him if he knew anything about the demon invasion, but they also didn't understand why they weren't being let in. And the head of Liu Shu started to answer that it was because it was up to her, not them. That made Feng angry and she started calling her a weasel. But Nana also added that the head of Liu Shu, just because Jeju isn't here doesn't mean she can do whatever she wants, and Sun An is not only the head of Guild Zero but also a friend of her strategic group. Outside, Sun An started asking the girls if Jeju was around. To which Nana replied that he's been reclusive since he left. He's at the Hadaimon Royal Palace. Logically, the Holy Sword Improvement Ceremony should have been completed by now, and they don't know what he's doing now. The head of Liu Shu will also add that this is the way things are and Jeju isn't here. Only she can raise the Hademon's banner, and he can only get in if he leaves those people behind. Feng, standing beside her, couldn't understand what she was saying and why she wouldn't let the civilians go. But the head of Liu Shu turned his head and said that they naive girls don't understand that they are in a war for survival, and the worst part is that they have no idea how long it will last. The city they're in is very large, but its resources are limited and everyone needs to eat. So the more of them